My job then is to bring this excellent symposium to a close. Thank you so much to the organisers and all the presenters for making the weekend go so fast. I'm sure you're all flagging by this point on Sunday afternoon, so I shall try and keep you going. And to that end, I'm going to jump straight in with a story. So, picture the scene. The ever-generous, well, you don't have to picture it, it's on the slide. The ever-generous Prince Vaisandra has been banished to the forest with his wife and his 2 children because he gave away more than the citizens could countenance. While living in the forest, his generosity is tested once again. One day, while his wife Maddy is off collecting fruits and roots for them to eat, a visitor arrives at Vaisandra's hut. The visitor is the Brahmin Jujaka, by all accounts a rather pathetic character, here because his young wife has told him that she needs servants. Having heard of Vaisandra's famed generosity, Jujaka seeks him out and asks for his young children. Joyfully, Vaisandra agrees to give his children away as slaves to this Brahmin. The children, understandably less happy at the idea, run off, but Vaisandra persuades them to return and to allow him to give them away, in order to perfect his generosity and ready him for future Buddhahood. At the pouring of the water that marks this momentous gift, the earth quakes, for, as the text tells us, this deed is enough to make your hair stand on end. But this is not the end of it. Jujaka ties up the children and beats them until they bleed. They escape and run back to their father and plead with him to change his mind, but he remains unmoved and steadfast, and Jujaka takes them once again. And finally, overcome, Vaisandra enters his hut and weeps. All this time, the children's mother, Maddy, has been kept away by gods disguised as wild beasts, preventing her from returning until after Vaisandra has completed his gift. When she finally does arrive at the huts and can't find the children, we encounter perhaps the most challenging of all the scenes. Vaisandra refuses to tell her the truth about the whereabouts of the children, letting her drive herself to distraction, seeking them out and imagining all the many terrible things that could have happened to them. He even tells her off for being so late home and sort of implies that she might be having an affair with one of the other ascetics living in the forest. Eventually she faints in grief, and only then does he revive her and tell her the truth. After all this emotion, the story gets much calmer all of a sudden. Maddy turns out to be absolutely fine with the giving away of her children, and she herself is soon given away too, willingly, though this time the Brahmin visitor is the god Indra or Chakra in disguise. And he immediately returns her to Vaisandra, praising Vaisandra's virtue. Meanwhile, Jujaka loses his way and ends up accidentally in the kingdom ruled by Vaisandra's father. The children are recognised and freed by payment of substantial ransom. Taking rather too much enjoyment in the ransom payment, Jujaka dies of overeating. And since nobody knows who his relations are, all of his wealth returns to the king, the pathetic young wife we hear nothing more about. The royal family set out to invite Vaisandra and Maddy back to the city, where Vaisandra's continued generosity is secured by a rain of jewels provided handily by the gods. So a happy ending, and a pleasingly symmetrical structure of exile and return, each gift restored in turn until we end up back where we started. But I think you'll agree that this happy ending can't disguise the pain of the middle, the climactic moment when our hero, and he certainly is our hero, for he is the Buddha-to-be or the Bodhisattva, willingly or even joyfully gives away his children to a nasty Brahmin and then refuses to tell his wife what he's done. And because of this painful core, the story has troubled Buddhists for millennia and Buddhist study scholars for over a century. Indeed, this paper owes its origins in part to an article by and conversations with Bhikkhu Anālyo, who is both Buddhist and Buddhist studies scholar, and who is troubled by the story to such an extent that he is adamant that it is not really Buddhist. I appreciate that I'm using the present tense here. I don't actually know if he's changed his mind in the intervening years, but this is conversations not very many years ago. And Anālyo offers a range of arguments in support of this position in his 2016 study of the Vaisandra story, which focuses primarily on the 2 versions in the Mulasavastivāda Vinaya. So the most important issue for Anālyo is that the ethics of Vaisandra's actions are contrary to Buddhism, for the giving away of others lacks metta or kindness and causes suffering. Vaisandra's treatment of Maddy is also troubling, especially his refusal to tell her the truth, and Anālyo suggests that this would be surprising if the story had originally been conceived as an illustration of a past life of the Buddha to be so close to his final lifetime that he had already accomplished the perfection of metta and truthfulness to a high degree. Now, this statement offers several possibilities: that the story was not originally Buddhist, that the story was not originally a Jataka, that is to say, a past life story of the Buddha, and that the story was not originally associated with the hero being close to Buddhahood. And it's worth noting that the last possibility has the most going for it. In the Theravada tradition, the story comes to be understood as the antepenultimate lifetime of the Buddha, an idea that seems to be related to the story's position at the very end of the copious Jataka book. But this tradition is not widely shared outside of Pali literature. In addition, the association between Jatakas and the perfections required for Buddhahood is not present in the oldest layers of the Jataka genre, which tend to show more interest in the idea of the Buddha as teller of all stories and revealer of karmic pasts. The other two possibilities are more difficult to contemplate, given that there appear to be no Buddhist versions in which the story is not a Jataka, and neither are there any early versions that are not Buddhist. But this does not daunt Analayo, who argues that the presence of a version in the story of the story in Somadeva's 11th century Katha Saritsagara demonstrates that it can function meaningfully outside of a Buddhist context, with the Buddhist elements therefore not indispensable. And he further argues that the key trope of satisfying the outrageous needs of a Brahmin is more at home in the Mahabharata than in Buddhist discourse. Analayo suggests that it is this motif that explains the story's first inclusion in Buddhist literature, where, he says, it serves not to demonstrate generosity, but rather to demonstrate the evils of Brahmins. In support of this argument, Analayo notes that criticizing the Brahmin Jujaka, identified in most versions as the Buddha's multi-life adversary Devadatta, is the reason for telling the story in the Sangabheda Vastu of the Mulasavastivada Vinaya. However, the other version of the story in this text, in the Vaishajya Vastu section, does frame the events as a teaching on generosity, and Analayo's claim that the excessive giving lauded there also, quote, has a more natural home in the Mahabharata, starts to sound a little desperate. So you can see that I remain far from convinced by Analayo's argument that the Vesantara story is not really Buddhist, or even that the type of generosity demonstrated by Vesantara is not Buddhist. For me, and for many other scholars and indeed practitioners, it is the quintessential Buddhist Jataka story, and the quintessential demonstration of generosity. For a start, the story is all over Buddhist literature. From the Jataka Devanana version, which is the one that I was recounting to begin with, to the Charyapitaka, a late Pali collection, the Jatakamala of Aryashura, the famous Sanskrit kavya, early Chinese Jatakas and also Tibetan translations of Indic Jatakas, the Mulasavastivada Vinaya versions studied by Analayo. There are Tocharian and Sogdian versions, there's a summary in an early Gandharan manuscript, not to mention the many Southeast Asian versions. And this is only the texts. Material evidence also reinforces the importance of this story for Buddhists from early times. It is depicted at Barhut, the earliest Buddhist site, from about 100 years before the beginning of the Common Era, in quite some detail on a prominent pillar. At Sanchi, a century or so later, the Vesantara story occupies both sides of the lower architrave of the North Gateway, and that's the image that we had on the first slide. It's by far the most detailed Jataka depiction in any Buddhist early Buddhist art. At Kanaganahalli too, we find Vesantara depicted quite extensively, while at some sites, such as Nagarjunakonda in Andhra Pradesh, the Vesantara story is so important that it is even depicted on depictions of stupas that themselves adorned stupas, what Catherine Becker has termed, quite helpfully I think, meta-stupas, and it's one such image you can see on this slide. In Greater Gandhara, it's the only Jataka to feature in both the visual corpus and in extant manuscript evidence. In addition, key events of the story are mapped onto pilgrimage sites in the far northwest, as noted by the 6th and 7th century Chinese pilgrims Songyun and Xuanzang. In short, this is one of the most widespread and popular stories in the Buddhist world, and evidence of its importance goes back to the earliest material evidence that we have for Buddhism. Yet Analayo is not the only scholar to have cast doubt on the idea of the story being originally Buddhist. And usually such arguments rely upon the fact that several of its motifs or themes are shared with non-Buddhist literature, such as the Hindu epics. As scholars such as Gombrich, Myland and Collins have discussed, structurally the story has parallels with the Ramayana, and thematically they are linked too, with each story showing what happens when extraordinary commitment to a particular virtue, dharma in the case of Rama and dana in the case of Vaisantra, is taken to its natural conclusion. I should say that none of these three scholars are actually suggesting that the Vaisantra story is not originally Buddhist. Their understanding of the parallels go in different directions to that. Meanwhile, the idea that one needs to be generous towards Brahmins, and the possibility that a Brahmin petitioner might actually be the god Shakra or Indra in disguise, is certainly a trope shared with the Mahabharata. Though it is at least as common in Jataka literature as in Brahmanical literature, I suspect it's actually more common, but I haven't actually counted, so I can't make that claim confidently. But it is at least as common in Jataka literature as in Brahmanical literature, and it also appears in Jain narrative, so it's one of those tropes that's shared across the literatures. For me, the shared aspects of the narrative tell us not that the story is non-Buddhist, but rather that it emerges from a common Indian narrative heritage. And I just want to take a moment to elaborate on this important point. Because too often the now outdated scholarly narrative of Buddhism emerging as a rejection of Hinduism prompts us to assume a Hindu priority. Even though we all know that what we now call Hinduism is very much a product of the encounter with practices and ideas of groups including Buddhists and Jains. For example, when people call Brahma or Indra a Hindu god, even when describing his place in Buddhist narrative or devotional practice, this is underpinned by the idea that Hinduism as a coherent and distinct theological tradition came first and had exclusive claim on these deities. And in fact, I would argue that such gods are better described as Indian deities, and that their frequent appearance in Hindu, Jain and Buddhist narrative should be sufficient evidence of their currency across boundaries. Quite how the boundaries between different religious groups were understood and articulated in the early period is, in any case, the subject of some debate. Narrative literature, I would suggest, is one key domain in which identities and boundaries were articulated, but these boundaries were articulated, at least in part, through the use of common Indian characters and motifs. And of course, we've already seen one example of this in Seema Chowan's paper yesterday. In other words, I would argue that the presence of wider Indian tropes and characters in the Vaisantra Jataka in no way detracts from its Buddhistness. Indeed, not only is the Vaisantra story Buddhist, I would suggest that it is part of a Buddhist exploration of precisely what it means to be Buddhist. And in addition, as will become clearer during the course of this paper, I also see it as a Theravada exploration of what it means to be Theravada. And I do appreciate that this term Theravada is modern and might come across as seeming an anachronistic term to use, but I'm simply using it here as a shorthand for a sense of belonging that's underpinned by the Pali scriptures. And you'll notice that I am referring to Vaisantra by his Pali name throughout, but that is just for convenience. Central to the Vaisantra's story's powerful narrative articulation of Buddhistness is the celebration of the Bodhisattva's ability to give away those most dear to him, usually framed in the Theravada tradition as exemplifying his absolute perfection of dana, generosity or giving. This is a virtue that is found in all the lists of perfections required for Buddhahood, and also exemplified by the many stories of the Bodhisattva's gift of body parts. A more basic reading of Vaisantra's virtue, however, and one that is distinctive compared to the literature of bodily giving, might highlight his non-attachment, and hence his ability to overcome what keeps us stuck in the cycle of rebirth, a rather fundamental Buddhist teaching. In this paper, I would like to show what insight can be gained from two types of comparative reading of the Vaisantra story. First of all, I will read it alongside another Jataka from the Pali collection that seems to be alluding to Vaisantra's way of sacrificing his children as being the most appropriate way to do so. Secondly, I will compare Vaisantra's gift of his children with the genre of bodily sacrifice Jatakas, which is immensely popular in Sanskrit literature, but rather resisted by the Pali tradition. My goal is to show what reading the Vaisantra story in this way tells us about the development of different visions of the role of extreme giving and sacrifice on the narrative path to Buddhahood. And perhaps it is just worth noting what I mean by the narrative path here. I'm using the language of Natalie Gummer, whose work on the sacrificial frameworks of Mahayana Sutra literature has strongly influenced my own thinking. And she has noted several times in her work that the Bodhisattva path is, and I quote, "in an important sense, always a narrative path, a path accomplished in and through stories," close quote. And that's actually a quotation from the Narrative Visions volume that Brian mentioned in the introduction that's out just at the moment. So not only is the Bodhisattva path something we understand through the stories of Shakyamuni Buddha's past lives, that is to say, it is in the stories, but the stories themselves, narrated, chanted, illustrated, recalled, accomplish the path too, in an important sense. So in that sense, the current paper also sits within a wider project that I'm currently engaged in with Dr. Chris Jones of Cambridge University, I think I saw is on the call, so hello Chris, on narrative Buddhology. That is to say, the ways in which the nature of Buddhahood is explored through narrative sources. So, my first comparison. I will likely not shock anybody if I suggest that it makes sense to talk about Vesantara's gifts as sacrifice, as well as great acts of generosity or dana. The links between generosity and sacrifice in early Buddhism have already been well demonstrated by a variety of scholars, with it generally agreed that, while Buddhism rejected Vedic sacrifice, it also adopted and reframed sacrificial ideology in various ways, including through a highly developed ideology of gift-giving. The idea that we should read Vesantara's gift as a sacrifice is particularly reinforced by a neat little example of intertextuality, or perhaps better, intratextuality, within the Jatakavartmanana. That is to say, the great Pali collection of almost 550 Jataka stories. A few stories earlier than the Vesantara, Vesantara, we must remember, is right at the very end of the text. A few stories earlier is the story of Kandahala or Chandakumara. The two names by which this story is known reflect the two main characters within it. The Buddha-to-be, the Bodhisattva, is Prince Chanda, and his multi-life enemy Devadatta is the evil Brahmin Kandahala. Already you can see one resonance with the Vesantara story in the stock character of the evil Brahmin. Devadatta, that multi-life villain, is also understood to have been Jujaka in the life of Vesantara. In the Chandakumara story, the Brahmin Kandahala is a different sort of evil, if you like. He's a religious advisor to Chanda's father, the king, who's a rather gullible and self-interested monarch, not very sympathetically portrayed. Kandahala, we hear, dislikes Prince Chanda because the latter has intervened to prevent Kandahala from making a living from bribes in the courthouses. And so Kandahala is waiting for an opportunity to get his revenge. And this opportunity arises after the king dreams of heaven and asks Kandahala how to get there. Kandahala replies that heaven is attained through carrying out a large sacrifice. Reasoning that the king would be suspicious if he simply advocated sacrificing Chanda, the sneaky Brahmin advocates a sacrifice of 4 sons, 4 daughters, 4 merchants, 4 elephants, 4 horses, and so on. I should say that most of the animals depicted in the manuscript that I put on the slide are not actually mentioned in the text, but I think the artist was just having a nice time. I particularly like the cockerel. So, in other words, out of a desire to destroy Chanda alone, Kandahala is willing to kill many others, just as, we are told, in his later lifetime, Devadatta's hatred of the Buddha alone leads to him actually causing harm to a lot of other people too. The bulk of the story of Chandakumara, then, is made up of various attempts to dissuade the king from carrying out such a horrendous sacrifice, and indeed he does, use a Scots word, he havers and changes his mind a few times before we reach the climax of the story. And so we hear lots of long and repetitive laments on the part of those lined up for sacrifice or others who are facing up to what is happening. But despite the fact that this is a sacrifice of many victims, the focus of the arguments and the laments is always on Prince Chanda, the Bodhisattva, the Buddha-to-be. And how, asked Chanda himself and a range of other characters, could the king possibly sacrifice his son when sons are so dear to their parents? Like the Vesantara story, the Chandakumara story explores the bond between parent and child, and the difficulty of overcoming that bond even for a higher purpose. And in a repeated exchange between Chanda and his father, we find what appears to be a deliberate echo of the Vesantara story, when Chanda implores his father not to sacrifice his sons, but to either give them away as slaves to the Brahmin Kandahala, or banish them from the kingdom to live as ascetics. And this is a set of verses repeated 3 times in the story. So here Chanda is advising 2 courses of action pursued in the Vesantara Jataka. Vesantara's father sends Vesantara away to live as a forest ascetic, and Vesantara himself gives his children away as slaves to a Brahmin, indeed the exact same Brahmin in the sense that it's Devadatta in a different previous lifetime. So it would seem that Chanda is pointing to a correct way to sacrifice your children, that is to say, one that doesn't involve killing them. Looking at these 2 stories side by side, as encouraged by this small though repeated comment by Prince Chanda, reveals several important things. Firstly, Vesantara's actions, though arguably harmful towards his children, are not violent in the same way as a physical sacrifice. Admittedly, he causes some suffering to his children, but, as the Buddhist treatise Milinda Punha tells us, he knew such harm would be temporary, and anyway, all bodhisattvas have to give away their wife and children in order to ready themselves for Buddhahood. As Vesantara notes in the story, he doesn't make a gift of his family because they are not dear to him, but because Buddhahood is more dear. And while it may not sound like it, this is in fact a selfless goal, since Buddhahood is a form of awakening that will enable him to assist others to awakening too. Hence, he sacrifices his wife and children's welfare for the greater goal of being able to relieve many beings, including these same children and wife in a future lifetime, from suffering completely, by teaching them the way to nirvana. As verses that he speaks to his children emphasize, they are the boat that will take him across the ocean of rebirth and enable him to later help others across too. Motivation is therefore key to contrasting the 2 stories. Chanda's father desires heaven for himself and will do anything to achieve that. He is easily deluded by the Brahmin Kandahala despite the entreaties of everyone else, and this underscores his self-interestedness and blindness. In contrast, Vesantara's ability to overcome his love for his children is a demonstration of the strength of his compassionate resolve, and leads to his ability to help everyone through realizing and then teaching the Buddhist truth or Dharma. The suffering of the children, though an important part of the narrative, underscores the difficulty of Vesantara's gift, while also showing that suffering is a common part of the human condition, which is, after all, the motivation behind the pursuit of Buddhahood to begin with. Just have a sip of water. This example of intertextuality helps us to view the Vesantara story as a reframing of sacrificial models, but there is other evidence of the importance of the language of sacrifice as well. As we move on to our second comparison, it is relevant to note the ways in which Vesantara's deeds are explicitly claimed as in the same tradition as bodily sacrifice. Several references in the story make this case fairly easily. Not only is Vesantara shown declaring his willingness to give away anything, even his own flesh, he is frequently said to be part of the lineage of Sivi or Shibi, as noted long ago by Alsdorf. In the Pali text, Vesantara is born into the kingdom of the Sivis, is banished because of the outrage of the Sivi citizens, and is repeatedly described in the verses as bringer of prosperity to the kingdom of the Sivis. Likewise, Aryashura's Jatakamala and the Charya Pitaka place Vesantara's lineage identity in a prominent place. A northern recension of the story found in Chinese and Newa traditions, which also shares this association with the Shibi lineage, even tells us that after giving away his children and his wife, Vesantara proceeded to give away his eyes, a deed related elsewhere as associated with a king who's called Shibi. Now, not all versions of the story note this lineage identity, but the association is clearly intentional where it is made. Vesantara's generosity is appropriate to his lineage. And this is an impressive lineage to be a part of. Buddhist, Jain and Brahmanical narratives tell of the famous King Shibi or Sivi, who variously gives away his eyes, uses his flesh to ransom the life of a dove, which is what's going on the slide here, or allows insects or other animals to eat him alive. And in Buddhist texts, of course, he too is the Bodhisattva. But across the broader Indian literature, he or they, a lineage of kings, are famed for their bodily gift-giving. As I argued in my 2017 study of Buddhist, Jain and Hindu stories of another important lineage, the famous renouncing royals of Mithila or Videha, variously known as Janaka, Nimi or Nami. And it occurs to me that this was the last paper I gave at the Spalding Symposium, was my paper about various Janakas. Lineages often offer a helpful balance of stability and flexibility in a shared narrative context. So even as the associations are stable and widely acknowledged, crucially including by one's competitors, many different stories can be told because there are many kings in the lineage. As such, stories of characters within a famous lineage can compete with one another to offer different views of ideal action within a familiar framework. In the case of the Vaisantra story being placed in the lineage of the Civis, I would suggest that the compilers and storytellers are implying that Vaisantra's gift is comparable to, and perhaps implicitly of equal value to, gifts of body parts found in other stories, that flesh and blood in the figurative sense is equal to flesh and blood in the literal sense. After all, we are repeatedly told that all forms of gift are required of all bodhisattvas. So there is an equivalence, and yet there is also an imbalance. The Vaisantra story is given particular prominence in Theravada cultures, where it is believed to be the Buddha's antepenultimate lifetime. That is to say, he then had one rebirth in heaven, and then a rebirth in which he became the Buddha. And hence it's associated with the absolute peak of his perfection, his readiness for Buddhahood. As well as being illustrated and retold all over the Theravada world, it is the subject of large ritual and performance traditions in mainland Southeast Asia. There's even a little cult around the Brahmin Jujaka, who's associated with receiving the ultimate gift and therefore with prosperity and success. In contrast, the Pali tradition of the Theravada school has much less interest in bodily self-sacrifice. In the Jataka we find bodily sacrifice celebrated in only 7 of the 547 stories, and there are likewise only 2 such demonstrations of generosity in the Charyapitaka, the story of Sivi's gift of eyes, and that of the hare who jumps into a fire to feed an ascetic. Bodily giving is rather a much greater preoccupation of Sanskrit collections. Of the 4 stories of Aryashura's Jatakamala that do not have a parallel in the Pali, 3 are stories of bodily sacrifice, including the famous story of the Bodhisattva feeding his body to a hungry tigress who's about to eat her cubs. 7 of the 10 classical Jatakas in the Avadana Jataka concern bodily sacrifice, and there are more tales of bodily sacrifice amongst the 34 stories of Haribhatta's Jatakamala than there are in the entire Pali scriptural corpus, though the latter is 16 times larger. Stories of bodily sacrifice also, of course, had a major influence in Mahayana literature as it moved from India into Central and East Asia and to Tibet. Indeed, in Mahayana literature, the bodily sacrifice of the Bodhisattva is absolutely paradigmatic. One of the reasons bodily sacrifice stories have so much currency in Mahayana contexts in particular might be because of their sacrificial overtones. As Natalie Gummer has pointed out, stories of the Bodhisattva's bodily sacrifice are modelled on wider sacrificial frameworks. Unlike a Vedic sacrifice, which involves offering the flesh of another for one's own benefit, the Bodhisattva offers his own flesh for the sake of helping others, refusing any substitutions. As Gummer and others, including Rekha Onuma, have argued, the bodily sacrifice of the Bodhisattva helps to build his Buddha body, both in its physical perfection, often associated, of course, also with kingship, and also in its ultimate perfection as the Dharma body. Yet, isn't the sacrifice of children, whether or not they are seriously harmed in the process, a substitution of sorts? It certainly appears to be a strikingly different model, and one that is morally and emotionally challenging, since Vaisantra's actions cause suffering to others, to innocent children, no less. In Maria Heim's important article, The Aesthetics of Excess, she argues that it is our emotional response to stories of excessive generosity that lies at their very heart. As she notes, and I quote, "We find a rich literature of anguish in the Jataka and Avadana literature and stories of self-sacrifice and extraordinary gifts." End quote. And such stories may, quote, "owe some of their widespread popularity to the fact that they give voice to considerable moral ambivalence." End quote. So the fear, the horror, the disgust, the anguish, the awe that audiences experience in response to stories gives them the power to engage us. The giving is meant to be excessive and morally ambiguous, because that is how the stories move us. This far, I am certainly in agreement with Heim. However, she goes on to argue that it is the distance between the hero and the audience that is key to understanding these stories. I quote again, "The imperturbable and balanced nature of great beings stands in marked contrast to the fear and trembling invoked in those who stand in awe of them." End quote. Now, this is certainly true in stories of bodily sacrifice. And indeed, as Reika Onuma pointed out in her book-length study of Gift of the Body Jatakas, the calmness of the Bodhisattva as he gives his bodily gifts, or as he sacrifices his entire life, is an important trope in the literature. In contrast, however, in the Pali tradition in particular, but other tellings as well, Vaisantara's sacrifice of his children, the moment that has tortured audiences for millennia, is shown to be deeply emotionally charged, for him as well as for us. We've already seen how the Pali version has Vaisantara overcome with emotion after the children are led away, tied up and bleeding, such that he enters his hut and weeps. The text goes on to tell us actually that he considers going after the Brahmin and killing him in order to retrieve his children, but he manages to resist that urge, reasoning that it is wrong to regret a gift that has been given. He knows he must overcome his attachment and achieve equanimity, but it is not easy. Later on, when Vaisantara's parents come to the forest to invite Vaisantara to come home, he asks urgently for news of the children, seeking, we're told, relief as if from a snake bite. When the children are finally reunited with their parents, Vaisantara faints on the spot at the emotion. In other words, this is not a dispassionate bodhisattva standing in contrast to his emotionally weaker family members, or indeed passionate audience members. Rather, he struggles. So too in Aryashura's telling of the story in the Jatakamala number 9. While Vaisantara initially feels joy at the chance to give a gift, and although he does not hesitate to grant the Brahmin's request that he give away his children, the deal is not sealed straight away. As in the Pali version, first Vaisantara asks if it would be okay to wait for Madi to return to say farewell to the children, but the Brahmin is not having that. He thinks that she is likely to obstruct the gift. Pesky women. Then Vaisantara points out that the children are too young and tender to make good servants, and so he suggests that the Brahmin should take the children to his father, the king, who would pay a large ransom and enable Jujaka to go and buy some proper servants. But again, the Brahmin refuses. At last Vaisantara gives in and prepares to pour the water to seal the gift, and in Kuroshi's translations we hear, by an effort of his will, water fell from the water pot. Effortlessly it fell from his eyes. After the Brahmin ties up the children and leads them away, they cry out to him in desperation, and Vaisantara literally faints on the spot. And after he comes to, he is still overcome with grief. So this is really no easy gift, although he never doubts that it's the right thing to do. Compare this with the previous story in the same collection, Aryashura's Jatakamala, that of King Maitribala. In this story, 5 demons visit the generous King Maitribala, the Bodhisattva, and ask for food and drink. The king offers his own flesh and blood. He is immensely joyous about this opportunity to help them, and while his courtiers try to dissuade him, he's steadfast in his resolve and argues at length and with great dispassion as to why it's the right thing to do. His serenity, even as he slices at his own flesh, is remarkable. We get the impression that, in contrast to the gift of children, a fleshly gift, even a gift that involves sacrificing one's life, is really quite easy. But despite his emotions, and despite his love for his children, Vaisantara does still manage to make this gift. It might be illuminating at this point to consider briefly a story in which we see a drawing together of these themes. And the story I have in mind is that of King Sarupa, which is found both in the Sanskrit Avadana Shataka and in the Pali Panyasa Jataka, which is sometimes referred to as the apocryphal Jatakas or the non-classical Jatakas. So this is a Jataka tradition that runs independent of the scriptural transmission, and I might add a collection that's somewhat more at ease with bodily sacrifice stories. The story of Sarupa is part of a wider cluster of tales in which the Bodhisattva makes a sacrifice in exchange for a single verse of teaching. And that's a cluster I've written a whole other paper on, so I'll try and be brief about it here. In most of these stories, the sacrifice or gift that's made by the bodhisattva in exchange for the verse is bodily. So flesh to feed a demon, the bodhisattva's whole body or life. In a few, there's a simple external gift, land or wealth. But in the Sarupa story, the bodhisattva king Sarupa feeds first his son and then his wife to a demon in exchange for the verse. Now, the demon turns out to be Chakra in disguise, and the appearance, quite graphically described in the text, of Sarupa's family members being crunched up and eaten, turns out to have been an illusion. But at the heart of the story, we have the same challenging experience of wondering how to approve of the bodhisattva causing harm to those he loves, even if it is for the greater good of receiving a verse of Dharma, which is best interpreted as a step towards creating his own Buddha body, the body of Dharma. Key to this story, apart from its rareness in the cluster, which likely suggests discomfort with this particular form of sacrifice, is that Sarupa, though desperate for a verse of Dharma, initially refuses the demon's request for his son. He claims that the price is not appropriate. Now, this refusal is really striking because the bodhisattva is famous for giving whatever he is asked for without hesitation, and yet here we see him pause. At this point, his son interjects and tells Sarupa that he's willing to be fed to the demon, and asks his father, please, to fulfill his wish. So, in other words, the reluctance of the bodhisattva as King Sarupa is an opportunity to show that his son, the sacrificial victim, if you like, is willing. We are unfortunately not told the same about his wife, although perhaps it is implied. No such reluctance is found in the stories in which what is requested is that the bodhisattva jump off a cliff or into a fire. The only concern he has there is a rather more practical one. So he's concerned to arrange things such that he does get to hear the verse of Dharma before he dies. My point here is that although on first glance it might seem like it would be easier to give up something external than to give one's own body, and indeed commentarial hierarchies of gift-giving usually place gifts of wife and children below gifts of bodily parts or indeed sacrifice of life. But the narrative suggests something different. They suggest that it is easier for the bodhisattva to give away his body or sacrifice his life, and it is easier for him in the same way that it is easier for us as an audience, because it doesn't cause harm to others. When the bodhisattva boldly plucks out his eyes to give to a blind Brahmin, we might think he's crazy, or we might think he is magnificent. But we don't worry about the harm being done to anyone else, unless we're Jains, of course, for Jain narrative traditions famously reject Buddhist bodily sacrifice stories as causing harm to multiple tiny beings living in the body. When Vaisantra gives away his children, in contrast, we feel his pain, and this helps to demonstrate what an absolutely awe-inspiring deed it is, necessary and compassionate despite the pain that it causes. In contrast, one might argue, and indeed I do argue, that the amplification of stories of bodily sacrifice, where the bodhisattva feels no hesitation and experiences no emotion except compassion for the recipient or joy at the opportunity to give, these can certainly feel quite far away from us as simple humans. And it's worth noting in this context that even in Mahayana traditions, where the extraordinary bodily sacrifice of the bodhisattva is widely celebrated as paradigmatic, it is rare to find any sense that this is something for other bodhisattvas to aspire to as well. So, for example, the Rastrapala Paripricha Sutra recounts 50 such jatakas, lauding the great deeds of the bodhisattva, but then offers an alternative to all these bodily sacrifices, namely the path of asceticism, which is held up as equivalent and hence a better option, as discussed by Daniel Bucher. Other equivalences in other Mahayana sutras have been studied by Natalie Gamma, as she points out in her Sacrificial Sutras article, I quote, "Sacrificing one's body may eventually result in obtaining a Dharma body, but the Dharma body itself can be sacrificed and consumed in its stead through the ritual of recitation." End quote. In other words, certain Mahayana sutras laud the Buddha's own path through the narratives of jatakas, but then advocate performative interactions with the text instead of suggesting that others should follow the path of bodily self-sacrifice themselves. So to conclude, While early Sanskrit literature shows a strong preference for stories of bodily sacrifice, and Mahayana literature even more so, Theravada literature, art and practice seems to celebrate a different sort of sacrifice. The Pali preoccupation with the story of Vaisantra may be partly in response to the rise of bodily sacrifice stories in other schools of Buddhism, in particular in the Mahayana. This is why I say that it's a distinctively Theravada expression of Buddhahood. But more broadly across Buddhist literature, the Vaisantra story explores the idea that it is harder to give up one's family members than it is to detach from one's own body or life, because of the pain involved. And yet it is no less necessary. Letting go in the form of renunciation and giving is of course key to the continuation of the path of monasticism and to lay support of that path. But this is more than a story of generosity. It's about sacrificing family ties for the sake of something far greater for all beings, not just for the person making the sacrifice. Equanimity and the ability to overcome one's attachments is at the heart of the path to Buddhahood. For Buddhahood requires an advanced, compassionate love for all beings, without discrimination. We, the audience, might find Vaisantra's giving uncomfortable, even offensive, as Analayo certainly does, and Vaisantra himself finds it deeply challenging too, but in many ways the story can be understood as a Buddhist exploration of precisely this difficulty. After all, it's not easy being a Buddha. Thank you.